The clatter of dishes echoed through the industrial kitchen of the Sterling Rose, one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants. Steam rose from the industrial sinks, where Elena Morrison stood, her hands submerged in hot, soapy water, carefully feeling each plate before setting it on the drying rack. Her movements were methodical, practiced, careful. A white cane leaned against the counter beside her, its red tip catching the harsh fluorescent light. In the dining room beyond the swinging doors, crystal chandeliers illuminated tables draped in pristine white linen. The soft murmur of wealthy conversations mixed with the gentle clink of silverware against fine china. Men in $1,000 suits discussed mergers and acquisitions. Women in designer gowns compared vacation homes in the Hamptons. The restaurant's carefully curated atmosphere of refined elegance was a world away from the cramped, hot kitchen where Elena worked. She had been blind for 8 years. 8 long years since that rainy night when everything changed. 8 years of learning to navigate a world of darkness, of rebuilding a life from fragments, of accepting that some dreams die so that survival can take their place. To the waitstaff rushing past her, to the sous chefs barking orders, to the restaurant manager counting receipts in his office, Elena was simply the quiet dishwasher who never complained, never missed a shift, and never caused problems. They saw only what was visible, a woman in her early 30s with unseeing eyes doing one of the lowest paid jobs in the establishment. But what nobody knew was that those same hands now washing dishes had once commanded standing ovations in concert halls. What they couldn't see was that behind those clouded eyes lived the memory of every piano piece ever committed to her fingertips. And what they would never have guessed was that tonight, in just a few hours, everything was about to change. Elena's journey to work each morning was a carefully choreographed routine. 73 steps from her apartment door to the elevator. 18 seconds for the elevator to descend. 42 steps through the lobby, greeting Mr. Henderson, the doorman, who always had a kind word. Then the challenging part, navigating the crowded Chicago sidewalks to the bus stop. Her white cane swept in precise arcs, tapping out a rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. Left, right, center. Listen for the footsteps of approaching pedestrians. Feel the change in air pressure near doorways. Count the blocks. The world had become a symphony of sounds and sensations, each one carrying crucial information. The number 47 bus arrived at exactly 7:15 every morning. Elena knew because she could hear the distinctive wheeze of its air brakes, different from the other buses that stopped there. The driver Marcus would call out "Morning, Elena," and help guide her to the seat behind him. She'd fold her cane and settle in for the 30-minute ride, listening to the city wake up around her. Working at the Sterling Rose hadn't been the plan. Nothing about her current life had been the plan. But it paid the bills. And more importantly, it allowed her to survive without depending on anyone else. Independence was everything when you'd lost as much as she had. The kitchen was her domain. Over the past 3 years, she had memorized every inch of it. She knew exactly where each type of dish was stored. She could identify glasses by their weight and shape. She had learned to navigate around her co-workers by their footsteps and the sounds they made. Carlos, the line cook, always whistled softly while he worked. Sarah, the prep chef, wore boots that clicked distinctly. Maria, her fellow dishwasher and closest friend at work, hummed old Spanish songs under her breath. The rhythm of the kitchen was its own kind of music. The sizzle of pans, the chop of knives, the timer bells, the rush of water. Elena had learned to find peace in these sounds, to let them fill the space where other music used to live. But sometimes, late at night, when the restaurant was closing, and the last customers had left, Elena would finish her work and stand very still, listening to something else entirely. Through the kitchen doors, she could hear the grand piano in the corner of the main dining room. The Sterling Rose employed a pianist every evening to play for the dinner service. Usually it was Mr. Patterson, a retired music teacher who played gentle classical pieces that blended into the background. Safe, forgettable. Nothing that would distract from the conversations or the carefully plated meals. But to Elena, even Mr. Patterson's simple renditions were torture and salvation combined. She would pause in her work hands, stilled in the dishwater, and listen. Her fingers would begin to move unconsciously, playing invisible keys in perfect time with the music drifting through the doors. Her muscle memory was so strong that even after 8 years, her hands remembered every piece, every phrase, every subtle dynamic change. Maria had caught her once, standing motionless with her hands moving through the air. "You know piano?" Maria had asked, her voice gentle with understanding. Elena had simply nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. Maria never mentioned it again, but sometimes Elena would feel her friend's hand squeeze her shoulder in silent support when the music played. What Elena never told anyone, what she kept locked away in the deepest part of herself, was what she'd lost that rainy November night 8 years ago. Her name had been known in classical music circles. Elena Morrison, the rising star. The prodigy who had been accepted to Juilliard at 16. The pianist who critics said had the potential to be one of the greats. At 24, she'd been preparing for her debut performance with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, a concert that would have launched her career into the stratosphere. The piece was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. She had practiced it obsessively perfectly. Every note was committed not just to memory, but to her very soul. The rehearsals with the orchestra had gone beautifully. The conductor, Maestro Holloway, had told her she was ready, that she was going to be magnificent. The concert was scheduled for a Friday night. On Thursday afternoon, Elena had driven to the concert hall for one final run-through. The rain had started as a drizzle, but quickly became a downpour. She remembered windshield wipers working furiously, headlights reflecting off wet pavement, her own excitement and nervous energy making her hands grip the steering wheel too tightly. She didn't see the truck running the red light. One moment she was thinking about the opening measures of the Rachmaninoff. The next, there was the scream of metal, the explosion of glass, the sensation of her world spinning violently out of control, and then nothing but darkness. She woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed. The physical injuries had been significant, but would heal. A broken collarbone, 3 cracked ribs, a fractured wrist. But it was the doctor's other words that had shattered her completely severe traumatic injury to the optic nerves. Irreversible. She would never see again. The immediate aftermath was a blur of grief so profound it had nearly destroyed her. The concert was canceled. Her career evaporated overnight. Her fellow students visited at first, but their pity and awkward condolences only made things worse. Her fiancé, another pianist she'd met at Juilliard, stayed for 6 months before admitting he couldn't handle it. He left. For 2 years, Elena had barely functioned. She'd withdrawn from Juilliard, moved home with her parents, and existed in a fog of depression and loss. The idea of playing piano again was unthinkable. How could she perform when she couldn't see the keys, couldn't read music, couldn't make eye contact with an audience? Her parents had tried everything to help, but eventually their savings ran out. Elena had forced herself to face reality. She needed to learn to live independently to support herself. She attended rehabilitation programs, learned to use a cane, took classes in daily living skills for the blind. And she'd moved to Chicago, determined to make a life that didn't depend on anyone's pity or charity. The dishwashing job had been the first one she'd been offered. It didn't require sight, just careful attention and a willingness to work hard. So she'd taken it, telling herself it was temporary, knowing deep down it was probably permanent. For 6 years now, she had worked at the Sterling Rose. And for 6 years, she had walked past that grand piano every time she arrived, and every time she left, never touching it, never allowing herself to even get close. The pain of that proximity was almost unbearable, but somehow it also kept a tiny ember of her former self alive. Tonight, though, tonight that ember was about to burst into flame. The energy in the Sterling Rose that Thursday evening was different from the usual refined calm. Elena could feel it the moment she arrived for her shift. The kitchen staff was moving faster, speaking in clipped, urgent tones. Extra waiters had been called in. She could hear Mr. Brennan, the restaurant manager, giving instructions with unusual intensity. "Everything must be perfect tonight," he was saying. "The Chicago Arts Foundation Gala is our most important event of the year. We have board members, major donors, city officials. These are the people who keep the arts alive in this city." Elena hung her coat on her designated hook and made her way carefully to her station at the sinks. Maria was already there, and she grabbed Elena's hand in greeting. "Big night tonight," Maria whispered. "They say there are going to be millionaires and famous people. Even the mayor might come." "Just means more dishes for us," Elena replied, with a slight smile. But her heart had already begun beating faster. The Chicago Arts Foundation. She knew that organization well. 8 years ago, they had been preparing to sponsor her debut concert. They had believed in her. And now she would be in the kitchen washing their dishes while they celebrated the arts she could no longer be part of. The irony was almost poetic in its cruelty. As the evening progressed, the kitchen became a controlled chaos of activity. Orders came rapidly. Plates of exquisitely prepared food moved from station to station like an assembly line of edible art. Elena worked steadily, her hands moving with practiced efficiency through the endless stream of dishes. But her ears were tuned to the dining room. She could hear fragments of conversation when waiters pushed through the doors. She heard the name Jonathan Pierce mentioned several times, and her breath caught in her throat. Jonathan Pierce. She knew that name intimately. He had been her classmate at Juilliard, her rival, her friend. They had pushed each other to be better, competing in every competition, comparing notes after every lesson. He'd been talented, brilliant even, but critics had always said Elena had something special, something extra that elevated her playing beyond mere technical mastery. After her accident, Jonathan had visited her once in the hospital. The visit had been awkward, painful. She'd seen the relief in his face, that it was her and not him whose career had ended. She'd never spoken to him again after that day. And now he was here. Jonathan Pierce, who had gone on to have the career that should have been hers, who performed in the world's greatest concert halls, who recorded albums and won awards, who lived the life she should have been living. "They say he's the best pianist in Chicago now," one waiter commented as he scraped plates at Elena's station. Mr. Brennan paid a fortune to book him for tonight. The guests specifically requested live piano music, and Pierce is supposed to be incredible. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she took the dishes. She forced herself to breathe steadily to push down the surge of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. This was her life now. Jonathan was the pianist. She was the dishwasher. That was reality. Around 8 o'clock, the private dining room was full. Elena could hear the buzz of animated conversation, The pop of champagne corks, the clinking of glasses for toasts. Someone made a speech about the importance of supporting the arts. There was applause. More toasts. And then she heard it. Mr. Brennan's voice louder than usual, with an edge of concern. He was speaking rapidly on his phone just outside the kitchen door. Elena's acute hearing caught every word. "What do you mean you're not going to make it, Mr. Pierce? This is completely unacceptable. We have a room full of Chicago's most influential arts patrons expecting. I understand there's been an accident, but surely—" "No, I understand. Yes, of course, I hope no one was injured." Elena heard him end the call. Then came a string of muttered curses that would have been shocking coming from the usually composed Mr. Brennan. She heard him immediately dial another number. "This is Thomas Brennan from the Sterling Rose. I need a pianist immediately for a private event. It's extremely urgent." "Yes, tonight. Right now, actually. I understand it's short notice, but—" "No. Do you have anyone else on your roster who might—" "I see. Thank you anyway." Elena's hands stilled in the dishwater. She stood frozen, listening as Mr. Brennan made call after call. Each one ended the same way. No one was available on such short notice. Some had other bookings. Others were out of town. One laughed at the impossibility of the request. The kitchen staff had gone quiet too, everyone listening to the unfolding disaster. In a restaurant like the Sterling Rose, where every detail mattered, where ambiance and atmosphere were as important as the food, this was a catastrophe. "What are we going to do?" Elena heard one of the sous chefs whisper. Those people in there were promised live piano music. Some of them probably came specifically because Jonathan Pierce was supposed to play. "Pipe in recorded music," someone suggested weakly. "Are you insane?" Mr. Brennan snapped. "These are people who donate millions to the symphony. They'll know immediately. They'll be insulted. This could destroy our reputation." Elena's heart was pounding now. Her hands gripped the edge of the sink. Every instinct told her to stay silent, to let this crisis pass without involving herself. What could she possibly do? She was blind. She hadn't played piano in front of anyone in 8 years. The very thought of performing made her feel sick with anxiety. But beneath the fear, something else was stirring. A voice she'd kept buried for so long was suddenly screaming to be heard. This might be her only chance. Maybe her last chance. A room full of the very people who could have changed her life 8 years ago. A grand piano sitting empty, and a desperate need for anyone who could play. Her professor's words from long ago echoed in her mind. "Music isn't in your eyes, Elena. It's in your soul. It flows from your heart, through your hands. Everything else is just mechanics." Maria suddenly appeared beside her, gripping her arm. "Elena," she whispered urgently. "Elena, you should say something. You should tell them you can play." "I can't," Elena whispered back, her voice barely audible. "Maria, I'm blind. I haven't performed in 8 years. I would humiliate myself. I would humiliate them." "Or you would be amazing," Maria insisted. "I've watched you, chica. When the piano plays, your hands move like you're playing along. You know music. You love music. Don't let fear steal this from you." Through the kitchen doors, Elena could hear a woman's voice, sharp with disappointment. "Mr. Brennan, I specifically arranged this event around the promise of Jonathan Pierce performing. I have donors here who were looking forward to an evening of exceptional music with exceptional food. Without the music, this entire evening feels incomplete." "Mrs. Whitmore, please," Mr. Brennan pleaded. "I'm doing everything I can to find a replacement. Perhaps if we could just—" "There is no adequate replacement for Jonathan Pierce on 0 notice," Mrs. Whitmore said coldly. "I'm very disappointed. The Chicago Arts Foundation may need to reconsider our relationship with the Sterling Rose." Elena felt something break open inside her chest. Fear and longing and desperate hope all collided at once. Her hands were shaking. Her breath came fast, but her feet were moving, carrying her away from the sink before her mind had fully decided. "Maria," she whispered. "Help me get to Mr. Brennan." Maria took Elena's arm and guided her through the organized chaos of the kitchen. Chefs called out warnings as they moved past hot stoves and sharp knives. The space that Elena had learned to navigate safely suddenly felt like an obstacle course. But Maria held firm, steering her toward the swinging doors that led to the dining room. "Mr. Brennan's," Maria called out. "Excuse me, sir. Please, just one moment." Elena heard his frustrated sigh. "Maria, this really isn't the time. Unless you can magically produce a concert pianist in the next 5 minutes, I need to—" "I can play?" Elena said, her voice coming out stronger than she expected. "Mr. Brennan, I can play piano." The kitchen noise seemed to dim. Elena felt multiple pairs of eyes turning toward her. She couldn't see their expressions, but she could imagine them: confusion, skepticism, perhaps pity. Elena, Mr. Brennan's voice was gentle, but clearly doubtful. "I appreciate the offer, but these are very sophisticated guests. They were expecting a professional caliber performance." "No offense, but—" "I am a professional," Elena interrupted, her chin lifting. "Or I was. I trained at Juilliard. I studied under Professor Catherine Marshall. I was preparing to debut with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra before—" She gestured toward her eyes. "Before this." The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Elena heard Mr. Brennan take a step closer. "You're saying you're a trained classical pianist?" "A Juilliard graduate. I didn't graduate," Elena admitted. "I had to withdraw after my accident. But I completed 3 years of study. I had already performed in recitals competitions. I know the standard repertoire. I can play anything your regular evening pianist plays and more." Mrs. Whitmore's voice came from behind Mr. Brennan, sharp with interest. "Wait just a moment. Morrison, Elena Morrison, Juilliard, about 8 years ago." There was a pause, and Elena heard the woman's heels clicking rapidly across the floor. "My God. We all thought you had given up music entirely. You disappeared." Elena's throat tightened. "You know who I am." "Of course I know who you are," Mrs. Whitmore said, and now her voice held a note of wonder. "I was on the foundation board when we were sponsoring your debut concert. I was devastated when it was canceled. We tried to reach out afterward to see if there was anything we could do, but you'd left town. We assumed you'd stopped playing." "How is it possible that you've been here working in this kitchen and no one knew I needed to eat?" Elena said simply. "And I couldn't imagine playing professionally as a blind person. I thought that part of my life was over." She heard more footsteps approaching, more voices murmuring. Word was spreading through the dining room that something unusual was happening. The entire atmosphere of the restaurant had shifted. "Can you actually still play, though?" Mr. Brennan asked, his tone caught between hope and doubt. "I mean, without being able to see the keys, muscle memory doesn't require sight." Elena explained, her confidence growing as she spoke about something she understood. Every pianist who reaches a professional level has memorized their pieces so thoroughly that their hands know where to go automatically. Closing your eyes while playing is common. I've just had to learn to trust that memory completely. "But you haven't played in 8 years, Mrs. Whitmore said. "That's a long time. Surely your skills would have—" "I practice," Elena admitted quietly. "In my mind. Every day. I run through pieces mentally, feeling my fingers move through the motions. It's not the same as physical practice, but it keeps the neural pathways active, and sometimes late at night when the restaurant is closed, She hesitated. "I've touched the piano here a few times, just to feel the keys. To remember." Another voice joined the conversation, male, older, Mrs. Whitmore. "I know this young woman, or I knew of her." Elena heard footsteps approach, and then a hand gently touching her shoulder. "Elena Morrison. I'm Professor Davis. I taught at the Chicago Conservatory. I attended your junior recital at Juilliard. You played Prokofiev's Piano Concerto No. 2. It was extraordinary. You had something special, a quality that can't be taught." Elena felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Thank you, Professor. That was a long time ago." "Talent like that doesn't just vanish," Professor Davis said firmly. Then, addressing the others, "If Elena says she can play, I believe we should give her the opportunity. What do we have to lose at this point?" "Our reputation if she fails," Mr. Brennan muttered, but his voice had lost its edge. Elena could hear him weighing options, calculating risks. Mrs. Whitmore spoke decisively. "One piece. Elena, I'm sorry to put you on the spot like this, but we need to know if this is viable. Play one piece for us now. If it's at the level our guests were expecting, you can continue for the rest of the evening. If not..." She trailed off, the implication clear. "That's fair," Elena said, though her heart was racing so fast she felt lightheaded. 8 years. 8 years since she'd performed for anyone. And now she was about to play for the same people who had been waiting for her debut all those years ago. The cruel poetry of the moment wasn't lost on her. "What will you play?" Professor Davis asked gently. Elena didn't hesitate. She'd already known from the moment she decided to speak up what piece she would choose. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the third movement. There was a collective intake of breath. The Moonlight Sonata's final movement was notoriously difficult, filled with rapid runs and dramatic dynamic changes. It was a test piece, a way to prove technical mastery. It was also deeply personal to her. Beethoven had been progressively losing his hearing when he composed it. Yet he'd created something transcendent. She'd always felt a kinship with that particular piece, and never more so than now. "That's quite ambitious," Mrs. Whitmore observed. "Yes," Elena agreed simply. "It is." Maria squeezed her hand, and then placed her white cane in her palm. "You can do this," she whispered. "I believe in you." Elena unfolded the cane, hearing its now familiar click as it extended to full length. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. "I'll need someone to guide me to the piano, please." "I know roughly where it is, but in a crowded room." "I'll take you," Professor Davis said, offering his arm. Elena took it gratefully, folding her cane again as he began to guide her slowly through the kitchen doors. The transition from the bright, noisy kitchen to the elegant dining room was jarring. The murmur of conversation hushed as people realized something unusual was happening. Elena heard chairs scraping silverware being set down. She felt dozens of eyes on her as Professor Davis led her carefully between tables. 3 steps up to the platform, he murmured. "The piano bench is directly ahead. I'll make sure you're lined up properly." Elena's free hand found the smooth edge of the piano. She ran her fingers along it, reverently feeling the quality of the instrument. It was a Steinway Grand, beautifully maintained. She could tell by the finish, by the way it responded to her touch. This was an instrument worthy of serious music. Professor Davis helped her onto the bench and stepped back. Elena sat very still for a moment, her hands resting in her lap. The restaurant was completely silent now. She could feel the weight of expectation, of skepticism, of curiosity. She could imagine their faces, the wealthy donors in their designer clothes, the board members who held the power to fund or destroy artistic careers, the restaurant staff hoping she wouldn't embarrass them, Maria praying for her success. And somewhere in that crowd, Professor Davis, who remembered her potential. Mrs. Whitmore, who had tried to help her 8 years ago. People who had witnessed the trajectory of her life being violently altered. This wasn't just about saving the restaurant's reputation or filling the evening with music. This was about proving to herself that she was still Elena Morrison, the pianist. That blindness had taken her sight, but not her soul. That 8 years of washing dishes hadn't erased everything she'd once been. Her hands lifted and hovered over the keys. She closed her eyes, not that it made any difference to what she could see, but it felt right, centering her in the darkness that was her constant companion. She took one more deep breath, reaching for that place deep inside where the music lived. And then she began to play. The opening measures of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Third movement erupted from Elena's fingers like a storm breaking. The piece began with rapid ascending arpeggios in the right hand, a technical challenge that required precision and speed. Her hands found the keys exactly where they needed to be, muscle memory, and years of training overriding the 8-year gap since she'd last performed. For the first few seconds, she was terrified. Her fingers felt stiff, uncertain. She could hear the slight imperfection in her timing, the way the notes didn't flow quite as smoothly as they once had. But then something remarkable happened. Her hands remembered. Not just the notes, but the feeling, the joy, the absolute rightness of making music. The left hand joined in with its own pattern of ascending notes, creating a complex web of sound that filled the restaurant. Elena felt herself falling into the piece, letting it carry her. The technical demands of the movement required total concentration. There was no room for self-doubt or fear. There was only the music, and her hands, and the piano responding to her touch. She'd played this piece hundreds of times before the accident. She knew every phrase, every dynamic shift, every moment where the tempo needed to push forward or pull back. Her hands knew how to voice the melody so it sang above the accompaniment. They knew where to add emphasis, where to let notes ring, where to dampen quickly for dramatic effect. The restaurant had vanished. The crowd had vanished. Even her blindness had vanished. In this moment, Elena was simply a musician doing what she was born to do. The rapid 16th notes cascaded from her fingers in shimmering streams. The dramatic chords punched through with perfect timing. When the piece called for delicacy, her touch lightened to barely a whisper. When it demanded power, she unleashed the full force of her arms and body. Tears were streaming down her face, but she barely noticed. These weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of recognition, of coming home after a long exile. Every note was a declaration, I'm still here. I still exist. You took my sight, but you couldn't take this. The piece built to its first climax, a series of powerful chords interspersed with racing passages. Elena's whole body was engaged, now swaying slightly with the music, her face reflecting the emotion of each phrase, even though she couldn't see the audience watching her. This was what she'd been missing for 8 years. Not just the act of playing, but this communion with music, this transcendence of ordinary reality. As she moved into the middle section where the themes developed and transformed, Elena felt her confidence solidifying. Her hands were warming up, loosening, finding their old facility. The slight stiffness of the opening was gone. Now the notes poured from her fingers with increasing ease, increasing beauty. She was playing at the level she'd once maintained, maybe even beyond it. Suffering had given her music a depth it might have lacked before. The arpeggios climbed higher up the keyboard. Her right hand leaped across octaves with perfect accuracy, finding each landing place without hesitation. Blindness had sharpened her other senses, including her spatial awareness. She knew exactly where each key was in relation to her body. She could feel the geography of the keyboard as clearly as if she could see it. The piece's famous presto agitato sections tested her technical limits. The notes came so fast they were almost a blur of sound, yet each one needed to be distinct clear. This was where pianists showed what they were truly capable of. Elena's fingers flew the muscle memory so deeply ingrained that conscious thought would only slow her down. She had to trust her hands completely surrender to the years of training that had prepared her for exactly this. And her hands did not fail her. The middle development section brought brief moments of calm before the storm resumed. Elena shaped these quieter passages with exquisite care, letting the melody sing, letting the harmonies breathe. Then the intensity returned, building and building toward the final push. She could sense the room's energy even without seeing faces. The absolute silence of complete attention. The collective held breath of an audience transported. She'd performed enough before the accident to recognize that feeling, that electric connection between performer and listeners when something special was happening. The piece raced toward its conclusion. The final page was a test of endurance and precision, demanding that the pianist maintain intensity and clarity even as fatigue set in. But Elena felt no fatigue. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in 8 years. Every cell in her body was engaged, awake, singing. The last section featured dramatic chords alternating with rapid scale passages. Elena attacked each chord with precision, making the piano ring. The scales sparkled, each note perfectly articulated, even at blinding speed. And then the final measures, a series of powerful chords that descended with inevitable finality, ending with 3 massive chords that she struck with all her strength. The last chord resonated through the restaurant, hanging in the air as Elena held down the sustain pedal. She let it fade naturally, not cutting it off too soon, allowing the full richness of the overtones to bloom and decay. When the sound finally died away to silence, she slowly lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. Her heart was pounding. She was breathing hard from the physical exertion. Sweat dampened her hairline. Her fingers tingled from the intensity of the playing. And she was smiling, really smiling for the first time in longer than she could remember. The silence stretched. Elena sat very still, suddenly aware again of where she was, of what she'd just done. The confidence of performance began to ebb, replaced by uncertainty. Had it been good enough? Had her 8-year absence been too obvious? Had she made mistakes that a professional audience would have caught? The silence continued. 1 second, 2, 3, 4. Elena's smile began to fade. Her chest tightened with anxiety. What if they were silent because they were shocked by how bad it had been? What if she'd embarrassed herself, proven that her performing days really were over? 5 seconds. 6. 7. And then from somewhere in the back of the room, a single person began to clap. The single clapping sound was quickly joined by another, then another. And then the entire restaurant erupted in thunderous applause. Elena gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in shock. The sound was overwhelming, rolling over her in waves. But it wasn't just applause. She could hear chairs scraping back as people stood. She could hear voices calling out in appreciation. Someone whistled. She heard what sounded like genuine emotion in the sustained clapping. This wasn't polite appreciation. This was real enthusiasm. "Brava," someone shouted. Magnificent Elena sat frozen on the piano bench, tears flowing freely now. She'd forgotten what this felt like. The immediate feedback, the validation, the connection with an audience. For 8 years, she'd been invisible, just a person moving through the world trying to survive. And suddenly, in the span of one 5-minute piece, she was visible again. Not despite her blindness, but somehow because of it. She had played with every ounce of her being, holding nothing back, and they had heard it. The applause continued. Elena heard footsteps approaching, and then felt hands gently touching her shoulders. "That was extraordinary," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice thick with emotion. "Elena, that was... I don't have words. You've somehow become even better than you were." Professor Davis appeared on her other side. "I knew you had it in you. I knew it. That wasn't just technically proficient, my dear. That was artistry of the highest order. You played like someone who has truly lived, who has suffered and survived. The music had depths I don't think you could have accessed 8 years ago." More people were gathering around the piano now. Elena could feel their presence, hear their excited murmurs. Someone pressed a napkin into her hand for her tears. Someone else touched her arm in congratulation. The energy was electric, almost overwhelming. Mr. Brennan appeared, his voice filled with wonder and relief. "Elena, I had no idea. All this time you've been working in my kitchen, and I had no idea what you were capable of. I'm sorry. I should have asked, should have known somehow." "How could you have known?" Elena said, managing a shaky laugh. "I've spent 8 years trying to hide what I was. I was afraid. I thought if people knew, it would only make everything harder. The pity, the questions, the constant reminder of what I'd lost." "But you haven't lost it," a new voice said. Elena turned her head toward the sound. The voice was male, cultivated, authoritative. "You've transformed it into something arguably more powerful. I'm James Whitmore, by the way, Catherine's husband, and more relevantly, a board member of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra." Elena's breath caught. The Chicago Symphony. The orchestra she was supposed to have debuted with 8 years ago. "I couldn't help but notice, Mr. Whitmore continued, that you chose a piece associated with Beethoven's hearing loss. That wasn't accidental." "I assume." "No," Elena admitted. "Beethoven wrote some of his greatest works after he'd lost most of his hearing. I've always found that inspiring. The idea that disability doesn't have to mean the end of art. That sometimes limitations force us to dig deeper to find new ways of expressing ourselves." "Would you be willing to play more?" Mrs. Whitmore asked. "I think I speak for all our guests when I say we'd love to hear another piece. Several more if you're willing. This evening has turned into something quite special." Elena hesitated. The adrenaline of the first performance was wearing off, and she was becoming aware of how much emotional energy it had cost her. But she was also feeling something she'd been starved for: purpose. Meaning. The sense of doing what she was meant to do. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that very much." A waiter appeared with water for her. Elena drank gratefully, her throat dry from nerves and emotion. Around her, she could hear the guests returning to their tables, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The formal dinner party had transformed into something more intimate, more significant. People were talking in animated voices about what they'd just witnessed. Maria pushed through the crowd and threw her arms around Elena. "Chica, that was incredible. You were incredible. I'm so proud of you. I could burst." Elena hugged her back tightly. "Thank you for pushing me to do this. If you hadn't encouraged me, I would have stayed in the kitchen and I would have regretted it for the rest of my life." "What are friends for?" Maria said, squeezing her hard. "Now go make more beautiful music. I'll be right here cheering you on." Elena turned back to the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys. What should she play next? The Beethoven had been about proving herself, demonstrating technical mastery, but now she had the opportunity to show them other aspects of her musicality. "May I make a suggestion?" Professor Davis said quietly. "Play something that shows your lyrical side, The Beethoven displayed your technical brilliance. Let them hear your heart." Elena nodded slowly. "Chopin," she said. "Nocturne in E-flat, Major Opus, 9. Number 2. Perfect choice," the professor agreed. This piece was the polar opposite of the Beethoven. Where the sonata had been all drama and fireworks, the nocturne was intimate, tender, almost heartbreakingly beautiful. It was also deeply familiar to Elena. She'd played it at her very first recital as a child, and it had remained one of her favorites throughout her training. She didn't announce the piece or wait for silence. She simply began to play, letting the first notes emerge like a whispered secret. The nocturne's melody was one of the most famous in all of classical music, instantly recognizable and infinitely expressive. Elena played it with the kind of nuanced phrasing that can't be taught, only felt. The conversations in the restaurant hushed immediately. This wasn't the kind of music you could talk through. It demanded attention, pulling listeners into its gentle, melancholy beauty. Elena poured 8 years of loneliness into those notes. 8 years of grief for her lost sight, her lost career, her lost love. But also 8 years of hard-won strength, of learning to survive, of finding dignity in simple work. The music became a conversation between her past and present selves, between who she'd been and who she'd become. The nocturne had several cadenzas, places where the melody decorated itself with delicate runs and trills. Elena shaped each one carefully, making the embellishments sound spontaneous and heartfelt, rather than merely technical. When she reached the piece's emotional climax, a high, sustained note that seemed to hang in the air like a question, she held it just long enough, letting it resonate before gently resolving it. As the piece wound toward its quiet conclusion, Elena thought about all the people who had told her after the accident that her life was over. The well-meaning counselors who had encouraged her to find other interests. The fellow musicians who had stopped calling because her presence was too uncomfortable a reminder of how fragile success was. Even her own moments of despair when she'd believed them all. They had been wrong. Her life hadn't ended. It had changed terribly and irreversibly, but it hadn't ended. And now, in this unexpected moment, it was changing again. The final notes of the nocturne faded into silence. This time, Elena didn't wait anxiously for the response. She knew it had been good. She'd felt it, heard it in the way the piece had spoken through her fingers. When the applause came warmer, now more intimate than the thunderous response to the Beethoven, she smiled and gave a small bow while remaining seated. "Thank you," she said softly. "No, thank you," a voice called from the audience. "That was a gift." Elena was about to ask what they'd like to hear next when she heard the front door of the restaurant open. There was a commotion, voices raised in surprise. Someone was saying, "I'm sorry I got here as fast as I could. The accident cleared faster than expected. I can still perform if—" The voice stopped abruptly. Elena went very still. She knew that voice. Jonathan Pierce had arrived. "Jonathan," Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried clearly across the restaurant. How fortunate that you could make it after all. But as you can see, or rather hear, we've been very well taken care of." There was a long pause. Elena could picture Jonathan standing in the doorway, taking in the scene, the crowd gathered around the piano, the atmosphere of something special having just occurred, and most shocking of all, Elena Morrison sitting at the piano bench. Elena Jonathan's voice was uncertain, almost disbelieving. Is that really you?" Elena forced herself to breathe steadily. Of all the scenarios she'd imagined about this evening, Jonathan Pierce walking in during her impromptu concert had not been among them. "Hello, Jonathan. It's been a long time." She heard his footsteps approaching. The crowd seemed to sense the tension and parted to let him through. He stopped a few feet from the piano. Elena could feel his presence, could imagine him staring at her with that analytical gaze he'd always had. "I heard the last piece as I came in," Jonathan said carefully. "The Chopin Nocturne. You played it beautifully. I had no idea you were still playing. After the accident when you disappeared, we all assumed. You assumed I'd given up." Elena finished for him. "Everyone did, including me for a while." "But you're here," he said, and there was something in his voice Elena couldn't quite identify. Surprise, certainly. Perhaps discomfort, but also something else. "Working at this restaurant." "Someone has to pay the bills," Elena said evenly. "Not all of us get recording contracts and international tours." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. She heard Jonathan take a step back. The crowd around them had gone silent, sensing the undercurrent of old wounds and complicated history. Professor Davis stepped in smoothly. "Mr. Pierce, perhaps you'd like to sit down and enjoy the rest of the evening as a guest. Ms. Morrison has graciously agreed to provide music for our gala, and I think we're all quite satisfied with the arrangement." "Of course," Jonathan said quickly. "I didn't mean to interrupt. Elena, could we talk? Later, I mean. In private." "Perhaps," Elena said, non-committally. She didn't want to deal with Jonathan right now. She didn't want to navigate the complicated emotions his presence stirred up, the old rivalry, the sense of paths that had diverged so dramatically, the uncomfortable reminder of what her life might have been. Mrs. Whitmore rescued the moment. "Elena, dear, would you like to take a short break? Perhaps some water or food, you've earned it." "Actually," Elena said, making a decision, "I'd like to play one more piece. If that's all right." She turned her face in the direction of where she'd heard Jonathan's voice. "Jonathan, this might interest you. Do you remember senior year at Juilliard, when we both competed in the Tchaikovsky competition?" She heard his sharp intake of breath. "The least. You played La Campanella." "I did," Elena confirmed. "You beat me. Your technique was flawless, and I made that silly mistake in the third variation. I was furious with myself for weeks. Your interpretation was better, though." Jonathan admitted quietly. "The judges told me afterward that if you hadn't made that one slip, you would have won. You had the musicality I couldn't quite match." Elena smiled slightly. "Well, let's see if I can play it without mistakes now." "Shall we?" She heard murmurs of surprise ripple through the crowd. La Campanella. The Little Bell was one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. Based on a Paganini violin caprice, Liszt had transformed it into a showcase of pianistic fireworks. It required enormous leaps, rapid, repeated notes, delicate trills, and crystalline clarity at breakneck speed. It was a piece designed to dazzle, to demonstrate technical mastery at its peak. It was also, Elena realized, a piece she desperately needed to play right now. In front of Jonathan. In front of everyone. To prove something, maybe to them, maybe just to herself. "Elena," Professor Davis said gently, "you don't have to prove anything. You've already shown us what you're capable of." "I know," Elena said. "But I need to do this. Trust me." She flexed her fingers briefly, preparing herself. La Campanella required absolute precision. There was nowhere to hide in its exposed passages. Every note would be clearly audible, every flaw immediately apparent. She would be playing without a safety net, trusting 8 years of mental practice and the muscle memory of intensive training that had ended when she was 24. She placed her hands on the keys and began. The piece opened with a delicate bell-like figure in the upper register, supported by simple chords in the left hand. Elena's touch was light crystalline, making the piano sound like the bells the piece was named for. The opening section was deceptively simple, lulling listeners before the technical onslaught to come. Then the variations began. Each one increased in complexity, pushing the boundaries of what seemed possible. Elena's hands began to move across the keyboard with increasing speed and daring. The massive leaps that characterized the piece, requiring her right hand to jump from the highest register to the middle of the keyboard and back again in rapid succession, were navigated with perfect accuracy. Without being able to see the keys, she was relying purely on spatial memory and feel. One miscalculation would result in missed notes or complete disaster. But she didn't miscalculate. Her hands found every target with absolute precision. The years of training had been so thorough, the piece was so deeply embedded in her muscle memory that her blindness became almost irrelevant. If anything, not being able to see eliminated the possibility of visual distraction. She could only trust and execute. The famous section of rapid repeated notes requiring a specific technique to execute cleanly at speed emerged from her fingers with perfect clarity. Each repetition was distinct, the rhythm steady and driving. The trills were even and brilliant. The delicate passages sang with pure tone, while the dramatic sections blazed with power. Elena was breathing hard, her whole body engaged in the physical demands of the piece. This wasn't just music, it was athletics. Her arms, wrists, and fingers were executing movements of incredible precision at high speed, all while maintaining musical expression. The piece couldn't be merely mechanical, it had to sound effortless, joyful, even playful, despite its difficulty. She reached the variation that had defeated her in the competition all those years ago. The one where she'd rushed slightly and fumbled a crucial passage. Her heart rate spiked with remembered anxiety, but she forced herself to trust, to maintain the tempo, to let her hands do what they'd been trained to do. The passage came and went perfectly. She hadn't rushed. She hadn't fumbled. The notes sparkled like the bells they represented, crystalline and pure. The final variation was the showpiece, combining all the technical challenges into one extended fireworks display. Leaps, trills, rapid scales, powerful chords, everything happened at once, faster and more dramatic than before. Elena's hands flew over the keyboard. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her muscles burned with effort. And then the final ascending scale, leading to the last high bell-like note, followed by 3 powerful chords to end the piece. Elena struck each chord decisively, letting the final one ring out triumphantly. As the sound faded, she sat very still, chest-heaving hands shaking slightly from the exertion. She'd done it. She'd played La Campanella flawlessly from memory, without sight after 8 years away from professional playing. She'd proven something she'd needed to prove. The silence broke with applause even more enthusiastic than before. People were on their feet again, calling out in amazement. But Elena was only peripherally aware of them. She was listening for one specific sound. There. She heard it. Jonathan Pierce, her old rival, was clapping too. And unless she was very much mistaken, his applause held a note of genuine respect, perhaps even awe. "Elena," he said loud enough for her to hear over the applause. I've never heard it played better, not by anyone. That was extraordinary." Elena turned toward his voice and gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you, Jonathan. That means a great deal coming from you." It did too. More than she'd expected. Whatever complicated feelings existed between them, whatever paths their lives had taken, they shared something fundamental, a deep love of music, and an understanding of what it took to play at this level. His recognition of her achievement felt like vindication, like a door reopening that she'd thought was sealed forever. Mrs. Whitmore appeared at her side. "Elena, dear, I think you need that break now. Come with me. We have a great deal to discuss." As Professor Davis helped Elena stand, and Maria handed her the white cane. She heard Jonathan say quietly, "Elena, I meant what I said. I'd really like to talk to you, when you have time." "All right," Elena said, surprising herself. "Later tonight, perhaps. After I've finished playing, I'll wait," Jonathan promised. As Elena was led away from the piano toward the private dining room, she could hear the excited buzz of conversation, the repeated words, extraordinary, remarkable, incredible. She felt Maria's hand squeezing hers in silent celebration. She felt the warmth of Professor Davis's pride radiating from where he walked beside her. But most of all, she felt alive. Fully, completely alive, in a way she hadn't since before the accident. The music had awakened something in her that she'd kept buried for too long. And now that it was awake, she wasn't sure she could ever let it sleep again. The private dining room that Mrs. Whitmore led Elena into was quieter than the main restaurant. Elena could hear the soft clink of fine crystal and the rustle of expensive clothing as people settled into chairs. Maria guided her to a seat and whispered that she'd be right outside if Elena needed anything. "Comfortable?" Mrs. Whitmore asked. Elena heard liquid being poured wine from the sound and the faint aroma. A glass was pressed gently into her hand. "Thank you," Elena said. "But I should probably stick to water. I'm not accustomed to wine, and I still have work to finish tonight." "Actually," a male voice said, "James Whitmore, we'd like to talk to you about that, about your work, and about your future." Elena's heart began to race again. "I don't understand." "What my husband means," Mrs. Whitmore said, "is that I think we can all agree you shouldn't be washing dishes. Your talent is far too extraordinary to be wasted in a kitchen. No offense to Mr. Brennan. None taken, Mr. Mitter." Brennan's voice came from somewhere to Elena's left. "In fact, I'm embarrassed it took this crisis for any of us to discover what Elena could do. We should have been paying more attention. The question," Professor Davis chimed in, "is what happens next? Elena, have you given any thought to returning to professional music?" Elena's throat tightened. "I've thought about almost nothing else for 8 years. But thinking and doing are very different things. I'm blind. I can't read music anymore. I can't make eye contact with audiences or conductors. I can't see orchestra cues. There are so many practical obstacles that I convinced myself it was impossible." "But it isn't impossible," a new voice said. Female cultured, with a hint of an accent. "I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I'm on the board of the Chicago Conservatory, but my day job is as a neurologist specializing in adaptive techniques for musicians with disabilities. What you did tonight was remarkable, but it's not unique. There are blind musicians performing at the highest levels worldwide. With the right training and support, you could absolutely return to a professional career." Elena felt tears prickling at her eyes again. "I wouldn't know where to start. I've been out of the scene for so long. I don't have connections anymore, don't have a manager or an agent. I'm 32 years old, which is old for a pianist trying to build a career. The window for debuts and breaking into the field is usually much younger. But your story is compelling," James Whitmore said pragmatically. "A talented young pianist whose career was derailed by tragedy, who survived through hard work and determination, and who has now proven she's even better than before. That's not just a story about music. That's a story about human resilience. People will want to hear you play, and they'll want to hear your story." "Are you suggesting I market myself as some kind of inspiration porn?" Elena asked, a slight edge creeping into her voice. "The poor blind pianist, so brave, so inspiring." "No," Dr. Mitchell said firmly. "I'm suggesting you market yourself as what you are, a virtuoso pianist who happens to be blind. Your disability is part of your story, but it's not your entire story. Tonight you didn't play like someone compensating for blindness. You played like someone who has integrated their experience into their artistry. There's a difference." Elena took a shaky breath. "What exactly are you proposing?" Mrs. Whitmore leaned forward. Elena could hear the rustle of her dress, the clink of her jewelry. "The Chicago Arts Foundation has a program for supporting artists whose careers have been interrupted by circumstance. We provide grants, connect artists with opportunities, facilitate their return to their field. We'd like to sponsor you, Elena, help you get back on your feet professionally." And the Chicago Symphony, James Whitmore added, is always looking for unique programming that will draw audiences and generate excitement. We'd like to offer you the opportunity to perform as a guest soloist. Not immediately, you'd need time to prepare to work with a conductor, to learn how to navigate the logistical challenges. But within a year, perhaps sooner, if you're ready. Elena's hand shook, causing her water glass to rattle slightly. This was too much, too fast. An hour ago, she'd been washing dishes. Now these people were talking about concert halls and professional careers and opportunities she'd thought were gone forever. She started, then stopped. "This is overwhelming. I'm grateful, truly grateful, but I need to think. I need to understand what this would actually mean, what the expectations would be, whether I'm actually capable of meeting them." "Of course," Professor Davis said gently. "This is a lot to process. But Elena, I want you to understand something. What you did tonight wasn't a fluke. I've heard thousands of pianists over my career. You have something special. You always did. But tonight, playing through your blindness, through your pain, through everything you've endured, you played with a depth and maturity that takes most pianists decades to achieve. Don't let fear or doubt steal this from you again." The door to the private room opened. Elena heard new footsteps heavier and caught the scent of expensive cologne. "Excuse the interruption," a deep male voice said. "I'm Maestro David Sterling, music director of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. I was supposed to be at another event tonight, but someone called and told me I needed to come here immediately. Something about a blind pianist giving the performance of the year." Elena's breath caught. Maestro Sterling was a legend in Chicago, known for his exacting standards and his ability to draw exceptional performances from his musicians. She'd listened to recordings of his concerts countless times during her years at Juilliard. Maestro James Whitmore said warmly, "Excellent timing. We're just discussing possibilities with Ms. Morrison." "May I?" the maestro asked, and Elena heard him settling into a chair near her. "Miss Morrison, I apologize for being blunt, but I don't have time for subtlety. I listened to you play from the hallway, all 3 pieces, and I have a proposal for you." Elena's heart hammered. "I'm listening. Next season we're programming a concert series called Triumph Over Adversity. We're featuring musicians who have overcome significant obstacles to achieve extraordinary things. I'd like you to be part of that series. Specifically, I'd like you to perform Beethoven's Emperor Concerto with the full orchestra." Elena nearly dropped her glass. The Emperor Concerto. Beethoven's Piano. Concerto No. 5 was a massive work requiring not just technical skill, but stamina, memory, and the ability to collaborate with a full symphony orchestra. It was a piece she'd studied but never performed publicly. "The Emperor," she whispered. That's ambitious. You just played La Campanella from memory after 8 years away from performing," Maestro Sterling said dryly. "I think you can handle ambitious, but I won't pretend it will be easy. You'll need extensive coaching. You'll need to learn how to count measures and take cues without visual contact with the conductor. We'll need to work out systems for rehearsals and performances. It will require an enormous amount of work from both of us." "When would this performance be?" Elena asked. "Next fall, October. That gives you approximately 11 months to prepare. To be perfectly clear, if at any point I don't think you're ready, we won't go forward. I won't compromise the orchestra's standards for a good story. But if you're willing to put in the work, I believe you can do this." Elena sat in stunned silence. Yesterday she'd been a dishwasher, with secret dreams she barely admitted to herself. Today, she was being offered the chance to perform with one of the world's great orchestras, to work with a renowned conductor, to step back into the life she'd thought was lost forever. It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. It was impossible. It was everything she wanted. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I'll do it." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Elena played 3 more pieces for the gala guests, each one received with enthusiastic appreciation. But her mind was only partly on the music. The other part was reeling from everything that had happened, from the sudden shift in her reality. When the gala finally ended around 11 o'clock, Elena found herself back in the kitchen with Maria, who had waited faithfully despite her shift having ended hours ago. Mr. Brennan appeared, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Elena, I don't quite know how to say this. You're obviously meant for far greater things than washing dishes. It seems wrong to ask you to continue working here." "Are you firing me?" Elena asked, trying to inject some lightness into her voice. "God, no," Mr. Brennan said quickly. "If anything, I'd like to offer you a permanent position as our evening pianist. Better pay, obviously, but I'm guessing you'll have other priorities now." Elena thought for a moment. "Can I give you my answer in a week?" "There's a lot I need to figure out." "Of course. Take all the time you need." He paused. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry I didn't see what you were capable of sooner. You should never have been hidden away in a kitchen." "I needed to hide for a while," Elena said honestly. "Maybe I needed these years to heal, to become strong enough to face music again. Maybe everything happened exactly as it needed to." After Mr. Brennan left, Maria hugged Elena tightly. "I'm so happy for you, Chica. This is your dream coming true." "I'm terrified," Elena admitted. "What if I fail? What if I can't actually do this?" "Then you fail," Maria said practically. "But at least you'll have tried. That's better than spending the rest of your life wondering what might have been." Jonathan appeared at the kitchen door. "Elena, I know it's late, but could we talk now?" Maria squeezed Elena's hand once more, and then melted away, leaving them alone. Jonathan guided Elena to a quiet corner of the now empty dining room. They sat at one of the tables, and for a long moment neither spoke. "I owe you an apology," Jonathan finally said, "for after your accident. I visited you once in the hospital, and then I disappeared. I told myself it was because you needed space, because seeing people from your old life would be too painful. But the truth is I was scared. Scared of what had happened to you. Scared that it could have been me. Scared of my own guilt, because part of me was relieved it wasn't." Elena absorbed this. "At least you're honest about it now. I've thought about you so many times over the years." Jonathan continued. "Wondered what happened to you, where you'd gone. I even tried to find you once, but you disappeared completely. And now I discover you've been here in Chicago the whole time, working in a restaurant kitchen, still carrying all that talent but not using it. It breaks my heart." "I'm using it now," Elena said quietly. "Or I will be." "Yes," Jonathan agreed. "And I'm glad." "Elena, you were always better than me. More talented, more passionate, more everything. The only reason I beat you in competitions was that I practiced more, followed the rules better. But you had something I never had, real artistry. Tonight proved that hasn't changed. If anything, it's deepened." "Thank you," Elena said. "That means a lot." "I want to help," Jonathan said. "However I can. If you need someone to practice with, to give you feedback, to help you work through the challenges of performing without sight. I'm here. No rivalry, no competition. Just one musician helping another." Elena felt a rush of gratitude. "I might take you up on that. There's so much I need to relearn, so many practical problems to solve. They talked for another hour about music and life and the 8 years that had passed. It wasn't quite a reconciliation, too much had happened for that, but it was a new beginning, a chance to reshape their relationship into something healthier. When Elena finally made her way home in the early hours of the morning, her white cane tapping out its familiar rhythm on the sidewalk, she felt different. Lighter, somehow. As if she'd been carrying a weight for so long, she'd forgotten it was there, and someone had finally lifted it away. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Elena met with Dr. Mitchell, who helped her develop strategies for memorizing music without being able to read scores. She met with Maestro Sterling, who was demanding but patient as they worked out systems for how she would take his cues during orchestral performances. She met with Mrs. Whitmore and the Arts Foundation Board, who formalized the sponsorship that would allow her to focus on music full-time. She gave notice at the Sterling Rose. Mr. Brennan was gracious, even hosting a small farewell gathering for her where she played one last time in the restaurant. The kitchen staff came out to listen, many of them hearing her play for the first time. Maria cried and made Elena promise to save her a front-row ticket when she performed with the symphony. Elena found a new apartment closer to the conservatory where she'd been granted practice room privileges. She spent hours each day at the piano, not just preparing the Emperor Concerto, but rebuilding her technique, expanding her memorized repertoire, working on the physical stamina required for long performances. Professor Davis became one of her regular coaches, helping her polish pieces and offering insights from his decades of experience. Jonathan kept his promise, showing up twice a week to play through orchestral parts on a second piano, helping her learn to follow a conductor's tempo changes and cues. But the most important work was internal. Elena had to confront the fear and shame she'd carried for 8 years. She had to learn to be visible again, to accept that people would look at her, would see her blindness, would make assumptions. She had to learn to let go of her old identity as the promising young pianist whose career had been tragically cut short, and embrace her new identity as a mature artist with a unique story and perspective. Dr. Mitchell connected her with other disabled musicians who shared their own strategies and experiences. Elena learned about tactile marking systems for finding her place in scores, about careful spatial memory techniques, about the psychological challenges of performing with a disability in a world that often saw disability as weakness. She also learned slowly to talk about her experience, to tell her story without shame, to acknowledge that yes, losing her sight had been devastating, but it hadn't destroyed her essential self. She was still Elena Morrison, pianist. She'd just had to find a new way of being herself. 3 months after that fateful night at the Sterling Rose, Elena gave her first official performance since the accident, a solo recital at a small venue sponsored by the Arts Foundation. The program included the Beethoven Moonlight Sonata, the Chopin Nocturne, and several other pieces she'd played that night, plus some new works she'd learned. The venue sold out. Word had spread about the blind pianist who had re-emerged after 8 years. Some people came out of curiosity. Others came to support a comeback story. But everyone who attended left talking about the music itself, the depth of feeling, the technical mastery. The way Elena's playing spoke directly to the heart. Reviews in the local papers were glowing. One critic wrote, "Elena Morrison doesn't play like a blind pianist compensating for disability. She plays like an artist who has lived, suffered, and emerged with something profound to say through music. Her blindness is incidental to her artistry, which is considerable." That review made Elena cry with relief. They'd heard her. Not her blindness, not her inspiring story, but her music. That was all she'd ever wanted. The summer months were intense. Elena worked with Maestro Sterling on the Emperor Concerto, learning not just the notes, but how to integrate her performance with an orchestra. It was far more complex than solo playing. She had to internalize the conductor's interpretation, learn to count measures during orchestral passages, develop ways to stay in sync without visual cues. Maestro Sterling was brutally honest in rehearsals. That transition was messy, he'd say. You rushed the development section. Your tone in the lyrical passage was too heavy. But he was also generous with praise when she got things right, and his belief in her never wavered. They developed a system. Before each rehearsal, Maestro Sterling would verbally walk Elena through his interpretation, where he wanted tempo changes, what he expected from dynamics, how he envisioned the relationship between piano and orchestra. During rehearsals, she learned to listen for specific instrumental cues that would tell her where the orchestra was in the score. The orchestra musicians themselves were respectful and helpful. The concertmaster would subtly emphasize his entrances to help Elena stay oriented. The principal oboe, whose instrument had several important duets with the piano, worked with Elena separately to make sure their passages locked together perfectly. But the real challenge was psychological. Elena had to learn to trust herself completely. In solo performances, if she made a mistake, she could recover. In orchestral work, a mistake could throw off dozens of musicians. The stakes felt impossibly high. She had nightmares about getting lost during the performance, about starting in the wrong place, about the orchestra continuing without her as she sat frozen at the piano. She'd wake up gasping, her heart racing, convinced she couldn't do this. Stage fright, Doctor, Mitchell told her during one of their sessions. Perfectly normal, especially given what you're attempting. But Elena, you need to remember you've already overcome the hardest part. Learning to live and thrive after losing your sight was harder than anything you'll face on a concert stage. Dr. Mitchell also helped Elena develop mental techniques for managing anxiety. Visualization exercises, or in Elena's case, auditory imagination exercises. Breathing techniques. Ways to stay grounded in the present moment rather than spiraling into fear about what might go wrong. Jonathan continued to be a steady presence. They'd play through the concerto together with him, reading the orchestral reduction while she performed the solo part. He'd catch timing issues, suggest different approaches to tricky passages, and most importantly, remind her why she loved this music in the first place. "You're overthinking it," he told her one day when she was struggling with a particularly complex cadenza. "You're so worried about getting it right that you're forgetting to feel it. Close your eyes, well, you know what I mean, and just play what the music is telling you to play." She tried it, letting go of the anxiety and technical perfectionism, just feeling the sweep of the music. And suddenly the passage that had been so problematic began to flow. In August, Elena performed her second recital, this time at a larger venue. The program was more ambitious. Schumann's Kreisleriana, Brahms's Variations on a Theme by Handel, and Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit, some of the most technically and musically demanding works in the repertoire. The concert was recorded for possible release on a small classical music label. A filmmaker who'd heard about Elena's story approached about making a documentary. Interview requests came in from music magazines and podcasts. Elena was careful about which opportunities she accepted, not wanting to be reduced to an inspiring story rather than a serious musician. But she did agree to do some outreach work. She visited schools with programs for visually impaired students, talking about pursuing dreams despite obstacles. She worked with the conservatory to develop better resources for students with disabilities. She wanted her story to open doors for others to prove that disability didn't mean the end of artistic ambitions. September arrived, and with it the first full orchestra rehearsal for the Emperor Concerto. Elena stood backstage at Orchestra Hall, listening to the musicians tuning their instruments. Her heart was racing. This was the first time she'd play the concerto with the complete Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Ready Maestro Sterling asked, touching her shoulder lightly. No, Elena admitted. But let's do it anyway. She made her way to the piano, guided by the stage manager. The orchestra fell silent as Maestro Sterling tapped his baton to get their attention. Elena couldn't see the dozens of musicians arrayed before her, but she could feel their presence, their attention focused on her. From the top, Maestro Sterling called. And remember, listen to each other. Ms. Morrison, trust your ears and trust your preparation. The orchestra began the dramatic opening chords. Elena counted her whole body attuned to the music. And then her entrance, massive dramatic chords that announced the soloist's presence. Her hands struck the keys with confidence. She was here. She was doing this. The first movement was full of technical challenges and intimate dialogues between piano and orchestra. There were moments when Elena lost her place slightly when she had to listen hard for her cues. But she recovered each time, and by the end of the movement she'd found her groove. Maestro Sterling stopped them. Good start. Piano, you were a beat late on your entrance in the development section. Let's take that from measure 150. They worked through problems refining the performance. The second movement, slow and lyrical, required a different kind of listening. Elena had to blend with the orchestra, not dominate. The third movement's rapid-fire exchanges tested her ability to stay synchronized at high speed. After 3 hours, they'd made it through the entire concerto. Elena was exhausted mentally and physically, but she was also exhilarated. It was working. She could actually do this. Not bad for a first rehearsal, Maestro Sterling said. We have a lot of refinement to do, but the foundation is solid. Ms. Morrison, take the rest of the day off. We'll resume tomorrow. Over the next month, they rehearsed 3 times a week. Each session brought improvements and new discoveries. Elena learned the orchestra's sound, its particular character and strengths. She learned Maestro Sterling's conducting style, the subtle ways he communicated tempo and emotion. She learned to trust her fellow musicians to be there to support her, to catch her if she stumbled. And slowly, the performance came together. What had started as a technical challenge became something more, a true artistic collaboration. The music began to breathe, to sing, to communicate the triumph and nobility that Beethoven had written into the score. Finally, 2 weeks before the performance, Maestro Sterling called a complete run-through with no stops. Elena sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and nodded that she was ready. The orchestra began. And for the next 40 minutes they performed the Emperor Concerto straight through, just as they would on concert night. When the final chords faded away, there was a moment of silence. And then the orchestra did something unusual. They tapped their music stands with their bows and instruments, the musicians' traditional way of applauding a colleague. Elena felt tears running down her face. Maestro Sterling came to the piano and squeezed her shoulder. That he said quietly was magnificent. If you play like that in 2 weeks, the audience will remember it for the rest of their lives. The night of the performance arrived. October 15th, a date Elena would remember for the rest of her life. She'd barely slept the night before, running through the concerto in her mind, hearing every note, feeling every key. Maria came to her apartment to help her get ready. They'd remained close friends despite Elena's transition to a new life. Maria had been given a front-row ticket as promised and was almost more nervous than Elena. "You're going to be incredible," Maria said, as she helped Elena into the elegant black gown that had been specially fitted for the performance. "You've worked so hard for this." "I'm terrified." Elena admitted, her hands trembling, as Maria fastened a necklace around her neck. "That means you care," Maria said. "If you weren't nervous, I'd be worried." Elena's parents had flown in from the East Coast. They arrived at her apartment an hour before she needed to leave for the venue, both of them emotional. Her father, who had sacrificed so much for her early music education, could barely speak. Her mother held her tightly and whispered, "We're so proud of you. No matter what happens tonight, we're so proud." The ride to Orchestra Hall was surreal. Elena sat in the back of the car the Arts Foundation had arranged, listening to the city sounds, trying to stay calm. Professor Davis had offered to accompany her, providing a steadying presence. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I might throw up," Elena said honestly. "Like I might pass out. Like I might run away and never come back. Also like you might give the performance of a lifetime," Professor Davis suggested gently. Maybe Elena whispered, "I hope so." They arrived at the stage entrance. Elena was escorted to a private dressing room. She could hear the murmur of the gathering audience, the orchestra warming up. In 2 hours, she would walk onto that stage. In 2 hours, everything would change again. Mrs. Whitmore visited backstage to wish her well. Jonathan came by, giving her a brief hug and whispering, "You've got this. Trust yourself." Other board members stopped by. The concertmaster poked his head in to tell her the orchestra was ready and believing in her. Maestro Sterling came last. He sat down beside Elena and was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to give you a pep talk," he finally said. "You know this music inside and out. You've prepared as well as anyone I've ever worked with. Tonight, just remember you're not playing for the audience. You're not playing for critics or reviewers or anyone else. You're playing for Beethoven, for the music itself. Honor that, and everything else will take care of itself." Elena nodded, too emotional to speak. At 7:30, the stage manager knocked on her door. 15 minutes, Ms. Morrison." This was it. Elena stood, checked her gown one final time, and picked up her white cane. The stage manager offered his arm, and together they made their way through the backstage corridors to the wings. Elena could hear the audience now, hundreds of people talking and laughing, programs rustling. She could hear the orchestra on stage, their final tuning notes creating a chaotic but strangely beautiful sound. 5 minutes, the stage manager whispered. Elena's heart was hammering so hard she wondered if everyone could hear it. Her hands were ice cold. Her mouth was dry. Every doubt she'd ever had came rushing back. What if she failed? What if she embarrassed herself? What if she proved that blind pianists couldn't really do this after all? But then she heard something that changed everything. From the audience, she heard a voice. Maria's voice calling out excitedly to someone. "That's my friend. That's Elena. She used to work with me." The simple pride in Maria's voice, the uncomplicated belief cut through Elena's anxiety like a knife. She thought about her journey from the hospital bed, where she'd wanted to die, through the years of survival and hidden dreams to this moment. She'd already overcome so much. This was just one more step. "It's time," the stage manager said softly. Elena heard Maestro Sterling walk onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. He quieted the audience and spoke briefly. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have the privilege of presenting a very special performance. Our soloist Elena Morrison is making her orchestral debut after overcoming extraordinary challenges. The piece is Beethoven's Piano Concerto No. 5, The Emperor. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Ms. Morrison to the stage." The applause began. The stage manager took Elena's arm and began guiding her toward the stage. Her cane tapped out a rhythm. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. And then she was there on the stage, in front of hundreds of people. The applause swelled. She found the piano bench stage hands had marked it for her with a specific carpet texture she could feel with her feet. She sat down, folding her cane and setting it beside the bench. She adjusted her position slightly. The audience settled into silence. Elena placed her hands in her lap and took one deep breath, then another. She nodded to indicate she was ready. She heard Maestro Sterling raise his baton. There was a moment of perfect stillness, and then the orchestra began. The opening was dramatic, powerful chords from the full orchestra announcing the grandeur of the work. Elena counted her body swaying slightly with the rhythm, and then her entrance massive chords that responded to the orchestra's call. Her hands struck the keys with confidence and power. This was why she'd been born. This was what all the years of training had been for. This was her purpose, her calling, her truth. The first movement unfolded a conversation between piano and orchestra. Elena's playing was confident, her technical facility on full display. But more than that, she played with deep musical understanding, shaping phrases with intelligence and emotion. She was living every note, every phrase, every dynamic change. The slow second movement was transcendent. Elena played with such tenderness, such vulnerability, that the hall fell into absolute silence. Not even a cough or a shifted program disturbed the hushed beauty of the music. This movement was Beethoven at his most lyrical, most intimate, and Elena honored that with playing that seemed to reach into the soul. And then the finale, joyful, triumphant, technically dazzling. The rapid passages sparkled under Elena's fingers. The interplay with the orchestra was tight, exciting. The energy built and built, driving toward the magnificent conclusion. As Elena played the final cascading runs leading to the triumphant ending chords, she felt a joy so pure it was almost painful. This was freedom. This was victory. This was proof that she had not been destroyed, that her dreams had not died, that music could not be taken from her no matter what else she'd lost. The final chords rang out massive and definitive. Elena and the orchestra held the last note, letting it resonate through the hall. And then silence. For a heartbeat. 2 heartbeats. And then the audience erupted. The applause was thunderous, overwhelming. Elena sat at the piano, tears streaming freely down her face, barely able to process what had just happened. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. The orchestra was tapping their stands again, the musicians' applause joining the audience's. Maestro Sterling came to the piano and took her hand, helping her stand. He guided her forward for a bow. The applause intensified. She heard voices calling brava and magnificent. They bowed again, and again. The audience wouldn't stop clapping. Elena heard the sound of people standing, a standing ovation building and building until it seemed the entire hall was on its feet. "They want an encore," Maestro Sterling whispered to her. "What would you like to play?" Elena didn't hesitate. "Chopin, Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece that brought me back to music." The maestro nodded and announced to the audience that Ms. Morrison would play one more piece. Elena made her way back to the piano bench as the crowd settled. She placed her hands on the keys and let the familiar opening notes flow from her fingers. The nocturne felt different now than it had that night at the Sterling Rose. Then it had been filled with loss and longing. Now it was filled with gratitude and hope. The same notes, the same harmonies, but transformed by everything that had happened between then and now. When she finished, the applause was warm, sustained, loving. Elena stood and bowed one final time before being guided off stage. But even backstage, she could still hear the applause continuing. The dressing room quickly filled with well-wishers. Her parents arrived first. both crying, openly hugging her so tightly she could barely breathe. Maria pushed through the crowd and threw her arms around Elena, sobbing with joy. Jonathan appeared, his eyes suspiciously bright, telling her it was the finest performance he'd ever witnessed. Mrs. Whitmore was there with several board members, all talking excitedly about future opportunities. Professor Davis beamed with pride. Dr. Mitchell congratulated her on the psychological and technical achievement. Maestro Sterling told her she was welcome to perform with the orchestra any time. But the moment Elena would remember most came when a young girl appeared, guided by her parents. Elena could hear the distinctive tapping of a white cane. Ms. Morrison. The girl's voice was shy, perhaps 12 years old. "I'm Sarah. I'm blind too. I study piano. And I wanted to thank you. Seeing you tonight, hearing you, it made me believe I could really do this. That being blind doesn't have to stop me from becoming a musician." Elena knelt down and reached out, finding the girl's hands. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. Being blind will make things harder. You'll have to work differently than sighted musicians. You'll have to develop special techniques. You'll face people who doubt you. But your blindness doesn't define your talent. Music isn't about what you see. It's about what you feel and what you communicate. Don't let anyone tell you you can't do this. Will you?" Sarah hesitated. "Could I maybe study with you sometime if you give lessons?" Elena felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I'd be honored." After the crowd finally dispersed, Elena found herself alone in the dressing room. She sat quietly still, wearing her concert gown, processing everything that had happened. In one evening, she had reclaimed everything she'd thought was lost. She had proved to herself and to the world that Elena Morrison, pianist, still existed. But more than that, she had found a new purpose. She wasn't just a performer anymore. She was a symbol of possibility, a guide for others who might be struggling to imagine their future after disability or loss. The weight of that responsibility was heavy, but it also felt right. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. "It's me," Jonathan's voice said. "I wanted to make sure you were okay. You've been in here alone for a while." "I'm good," Elena said, and realized she meant it. "I'm really good. Just taking it all in." "It was extraordinary, Elena, truly. But I hope you know this is just the beginning. After tonight, you'll have opportunities you can't even imagine yet. Your career is about to explode." Maybe Elena said. "But you know what? If it doesn't, I'll still be okay. Because I proved something to myself tonight. I proved that I survived, that I transformed, that the accident didn't destroy me, it changed me, but it didn't destroy me. And that's worth more than any career." Jonathan was quiet for a moment. "That's very zen of you." Elena laughed. "I'm serious. 8 years ago when I lost my sight, I thought my life was over. I genuinely believed that Elena Morrison, the pianist, had died in that accident. But tonight I realized something: she didn't die. She just had to be reborn. And the new version is stronger, deeper, more resilient than the old one ever was. Well, the new version is also one hell of a pianist," Jonathan said warmly. "Come on, there's a reception upstairs and about 100 people who want to congratulate you personally." Elena stood, picked up her white cane, and took Jonathan's offered arm. As they made their way to the reception, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The pain, the loss, the years of hiding, the moment of courage, the hard work, and finally, tonight's triumph. She thought about young Sarah dreaming of becoming a musician despite her blindness. She thought about Maria, who had seen her potential when Elena couldn't see it herself. She thought about all the people who had supported her return to music. And she thought about the future stretching out ahead of her full of possibility. More concerts, more opportunities, maybe recordings, maybe tours, maybe teaching the next generation of musicians, both sighted and blind. But most of all, she thought about the piano, about the music that had saved her life, even when she thought she'd lost it. Music had been there in her darkest moments, locked inside her, waiting to be released. And now it was free again, flowing from her fingers, connecting her to audiences, giving her life meaning and purpose. The reception was crowded and loud, full of influential people who wanted to meet her, to be part of her story. Elena made her way through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, answering the same questions over and over. Yes, I memorized the entire concerto. No, I don't use Braille music. Yes, it's challenging, but not impossible. A music critic from the Chicago Tribune asked to interview her for a feature article. A representative from a major classical music label wanted to discuss a recording contract. A concert promoter mentioned possible performances in New York and San Francisco. But the conversation that meant the most came near the end of the evening, when Maestro Sterling pulled her aside for a private word. "Elena, I want you to know something," he said seriously. "Tonight wasn't a charity performance. I didn't program you because of your inspiring story, or because the board thought it would be good publicity. I programmed you because you're an exceptional musician. Period. Your blindness is a fact about you, but it's not the most important fact. The most important fact is that you have rare talent and deep artistry. Don't forget that as your career develops, don't let yourself be reduced to an inspiring story. You're a serious artist, and that's how you should be treated." "Thank you, Maestro Elena," said her voice thick with emotion. "That means everything to me." As the reception wound down and Elena finally made her way home in the early hours of the morning, she felt a sense of completion. The chapter that had opened with a terrible car crash 8 years ago had finally closed. A new chapter was beginning. She thought about that young pianist who had been so excited, so naive, preparing for her debut all those years ago. That girl would have been shocked to see where life took her, horrified by the accident, unable to imagine surviving it. But she had survived. She had more than survived, she had transformed, deepened, become more fully herself. 6 months after her triumphant debut with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, Elena Morrison's life had changed in ways both expected and surprising. The performance had been reviewed glowingly in national publications. The recording made that night had been released by a major classical label and was selling remarkably well. Invitations to perform had poured in from orchestras and venues across the country and even internationally. But the most meaningful changes were more personal. Elena had started teaching at the Chicago Conservatory, working specifically with students who had disabilities or who were developing adaptive techniques. She'd helped establish a scholarship fund for blind musicians. She'd become an advocate for accessibility in classical music venues and education programs. She maintained her friendship with Maria, who now attended all of Elena's local performances, always sitting in the same front row seat. Elena had reconnected with several former classmates from Juilliard relationships that had atrophied after the accident, now renewed. Her relationship with Jonathan had evolved into a genuine friendship and musical partnership. They were planning a joint recital for the following year. Most significantly, Elena had made peace with her past. She had returned to Juilliard to give a master class confronting the place where her old life had ended. She'd visited the site of the accident, a pilgrimage that had been difficult but necessary. She'd learned to talk about her experience openly, neither hiding from it nor letting it define her entirely. On a chilly April evening, Elena stood backstage at Carnegie Hall in New York, preparing for what many considered the pinnacle of a classical musician's career, a solo recital in one of the world's most prestigious venues. The program was ambitious, featuring works by Bach, Beethoven, Chopin, and Rachmaninoff. As she waited in the wings, listening to the audience settle into their seats, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The path hadn't been straight or easy. It had wound through darkness and despair before emerging into light. But every step had been necessary, had shaped her into the musician and person she'd become. Ms. Morrison, the stage manager, said softly, "It's time." Elena took a deep breath and picked up her white cane. As she walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, she thought about all the people who had supported her. Her parents, Maria, Jonathan, Professor Davis, Dr. Mitchell, Mrs. Whitmore, Maestro Sterling, and so many others. She thought about young Sarah and all the other disabled musicians who were watching her career, seeing possibility where they might have seen only limitation. She settled at the piano and placed her hands on the keys. The hall fell silent, and in that moment before she began to play Elena Morrison, Pianist, felt completely at peace. She was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The first notes of Bach's Prelude and Fugue emerged from the piano, crystalline and perfect. And for the next 2 hours, Elena took the audience on a journey through the heights and depths of human emotion, all expressed through the universal language of music. This was her life now. This was who she was, not the tragic figure whose career had been cut short. Not the inspiring blind musician overcoming adversity. Just a pianist, one who happened to be blind, sharing the music she loved with audiences who were grateful to hear it. When the recital ended, and the audience gave her yet another standing ovation, Elena bowed deeply, her heart full of gratitude. She had lost her sight, but she had gained something perhaps more valuable. The knowledge that she could survive anything, that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, that music would always be there to guide her through darkness into light. As she made her way off stage to begin the next chapter of her journey, Elena couldn't help but smile. The scared, broken woman who had hidden in a restaurant kitchen seemed like a stranger now. In her place stood someone who had learned that the human spirit, like great music, could transcend any limitation. The standing ovation continued, the sound of hundreds of people appreciating not just her performance, but her journey, her courage, her refusal to give up on her dreams. And as Elena stood in the wings, listening to that wall of sound, she thought about all the people out there facing their own challenges, their own losses, their own dark moments. To them, she would say what she'd learned: keep going, transform, survive, and find the music that lives inside you, whatever form that music takes. It's there, waiting to be discovered. You just have to be brave enough to let it out. Elena Morrison's story is a reminder that the obstacles we face in life, no matter how insurmountable they seem, don't have to define us. They can transform us, deepen us, make us into better versions of ourselves than we ever could have been without them. Her journey from promising young pianist to dishwasher to internationally recognized concert artist wasn't about overcoming blindness. It was about overcoming fear. Fear that she was no longer enough. Fear that her dreams were impossible. Fear that she had nothing left to offer the world. When she finally found the courage to step out of the kitchen and onto that stage, Elena discovered something crucial. Her talent hadn't disappeared. It had been there all along, waiting for her to be ready to claim it again. And when she finally did, she found that the years of struggle had given her something extra, a depth of emotion and understanding that only comes from genuine hardship survived with dignity. Today, Elena continues to perform internationally. She's recorded 3 albums, all critically acclaimed. She teaches masterclasses and mentors young musicians with disabilities. She's become an advocate for accessibility in classical music education and performance venues. But ask her what she's most proud of, and she'll tell you about the letters she receives from people not just musicians, but people facing all kinds of challenges who tell her that her story gave them hope. Because that's what her story is really about, hope. The hope that we can survive our worst moments. The hope that we can rebuild from ruins. The hope that it's never too late to pursue our dreams, no matter how many obstacles stand in our way. Elena Morrison lost her sight in a tragic accident. But in losing one kind of vision, she gained another, the ability to see what truly matters. Not the spotlight or the acclaim or the career success, though those things are wonderful. What matters is the music itself, the connection it creates between performer and audience, the way it expresses what words cannot, the way it transcends all limitations and speaks directly to the human soul. So the next time you face an obstacle that seems impossible to overcome, remember Elena. Remember that she spent 8 years in the darkness, both literal and metaphorical, before finding her way back to the light. Remember that she had every reason to give up, but she didn't. And remember that inside each of us is something worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth sharing with the world. Find your music, whatever form it takes. And don't let anything, not fear, not loss, not anyone's doubt, keep you from letting it out. Because the world needs to hear it.